Hey, Bill.
Good morning, Matt. How's Southern DMZ?
Welcome. Yeah, we do this every week. We need to work on who speaks third. That's the problem.
Do you want to do that again?
No. No, let's keep it rolling.
Okay.
We only do this every week, and every week I step on you. So we need to work that out. From the right, I'm Matt Lewis.
This is why we didn't get Crossfire. If we had smoother intros, we would have been
This
golden.
close. This close to getting Crossfire, and we botched the intro. Unbelievable.
It's unprofessional, Matt. Seriously.
It is, but if you're coming here for professionalism, you've come to the wrong place. That's not what we do. What we do here is a deep dive into great ideas. It's not about the superficial aspects, the polish. It's not about that. It's about the ideas, Bill. And we got you here.
Well, you have a big idea piece in the week this week. Where you're taking on the hot trend in conservatism, which is libertarian populism, and while you seem to have you seem to be somewhat intrigued by you. In the end, you say it's going off on the wrong course, at least as far as its utility to win elections.
Right. Well, first of all, if you haven't seen it yet, there's another dialogue here on Blogging Heads. Featuring Ben Domenech that came out recently. That's probably still on the front page about libertarian populism. If you want to know what it is, watch that. That's a good primer, certainly. Ben Domenech has been
can you sum up how is it different than being libertarian?
Yeah. So now I tried to piece together. There's some prominent people who've been pushing this idea, ranging from Tim Carney to Ben. To Sean Trendy, Ross Douthat has been not necessarily pushing it, but writing about it. And essentially, I tried to piece together what it is, and I came up with a few things. One is anti-bigness. So anything that's big government, big business, libertarian populism is against that.
So in theory, libertarianism could be, okay, everyone gets to run the free market. If you end up being a monopoly, so be it.
Well, I don't know about that, but the concern is that, and this is very anti-Scherian in terms of Bill Scher. You like it when government and business cooperate.
That is known as Scherian liberalism.
Scherian liberalism. When they collude, you like that, but
you can't spell Scher without fascist. Don't forget.
That's right, and you need to buy shares of this stock because it is going up. As Bill Scher
it has that German feel to it, Scher.
Scher, yeah. The Sheridan fruit, yes, there's something there. So that's one of the primary components is anti-bigness. But there are others. There is sort of a rejection of, quote, do-gooder paternalism, and even some Reagan-era reforms, which now, it's not that they're rejecting what Reagan did, but it's a sense that the world has changed. So, for example, instead of focusing on things like bringing down income tax rates, you should focus on things like getting rid of a payroll tax. And then lastly, there is a sense that we should reject Bush-era military adventurism. And so that's essentially what, at least I think, libertarian populism represents. And my piece of the week examines that and essentially argues that this is not the way forward for the GOP.
I mean, now, obviously, this is flying in the face of what Rand Paul has been arguing, that if we have to get back on a new set of legs, we need to reposition ourselves to speak to the younger generation, which are trending away from us. And if we emphasize our libertarianness, if we emphasize our dislike of adventurism abroad, and we emphasize, Rand doesn't really play up being for government out of culture war issues so much. I mean, he's anti-abortion, He's not really a gay rights crusader. But he is trying to have a different tone, at least, on immigration, though he backed off from actually supporting the Senate compromise bill. And he's making a rhetorical show of reaching out to minority communities, though that's been undercut by the whole Southern Avenger flap, which he kind of got a little testy about in NPR this week. But he's saying that he has some sort of special sauce that old guard Republicans don't have to broaden the Republican base. You're suggesting this is going off on the wrong track.
Well, a few things. One, the problem that Rand Paul has is that libertarian populism is in many ways contradictory. I mean, libertarians are essentially open borders, so that's where he gets the pro-immigration reform instinct. Libertarians are free marketers, but conversely, populists tend to favor protectionist policies like tariffs. They tend to favor subsidies in pork, and they tend to be nativists. You know, they want to build a fence with alligators. And so I'm not saying that it's an oxymoron. I mean, I think Rand, to a certain degree, has found a way to bring these two things together. But what we're really doing is trying to create what they're really trying to do is create kind of a new thing, rather than really blending two things together, which in some cases are contradictory. Well, so it is fascinating. It is fascinating to see this attempt. I think, again, you know, we can go into this more, but I think it's a bad idea for not only in terms of substance, which I disagree with a lot of the policy. I think it would be bad news electorally. But let me just make one point about one of the things, just sort of rhetorically, one of the problems I have with libertarian populism. I do think that conservatives need to be more populist in their rhetoric in the sense that they shouldn't be elitist. So Mitt Romney said things like the 47%, which was elitist. He said things like, he played up the whole "you didn't build that" line, which in a sense was glorifying, but the way that they played it up so much glorified entrepreneurs. But there are a lot of Americans who contribute to the economy and to prosperity who are police officers or nurses or whatever. They're not entrepreneurs. The Republican Party can't be a party that forgets them and leaves them behind if it wants to be a majority. So in that sense, I like populist rhetoric. The problem I have is that the populist rhetoric that I think some of the proponents of this libertarian populism want is the kind of thing that talks about how the fat cats are, the game is rigged and the fat cats are getting rich. And it's divisive and it's victim, it's pandering, and that's not the conservatism that I know. I hope that we don't go that direction.
It still feels a little bit to me like the libertarian populists are taking basic libertarianism and just slapping a populist label. I mean, populism is a sort of very fuzzy concept that a lot of people can say, everything that I want is what the people want, ergo it is populist. What you talk about in talking about pork and tariffs and nativism, I think does describe a certain breed of populist of years past. But certainly,
I would disagree though, because, and maybe I'm reading this wrong, but my take is that populist libertarianism, just to cite one example, would be against immigration reform. Now, if they were libertarian, they would be for it. And you look at the Cato institution, whatever. Right. You look at Cato, and they are supporting immigration reform. You look at libertarian leading folks like Reason Magazine and Grover Norquist at ATR. They support immigration reform. So, but my sense is at least that libertarian populism would be populist when it comes to at least immigration reform, which is one of the hot issues right now, that they would be against that. I think it's wrong to say. I think it's wrong to say this is just libertarianism, because
I agree with you in part that I do think for a long time there was a populist element to being anti-immigrant. But of course today, all the major unions, for example, are pro-immigration reform, which is a change for them. And there's more of an attempt to sort of say there's a common cause here between the working stiffs and the working stiffs from across the border who we want to join with and have a stronger working class, and it's not us against them. So I do think those. That's
a 5 years ago, Bill. It was different. I mean, well, you're talking about a very new phenomenon, which I think has to do with two things. One, the fact that labor unions are in such dire straits that they frankly need more people to pay in to fund the pensions of older members. And secondly, a desire by the left for political purposes to inflate their ranks. So you make a good point, but this is a very new phenomenon, and I don't think
I agree. It's a new phenomenon,
populism has changed.
But I think there is a progressive populism that goes beyond that. I don't think it is suddenly pro-immigrant. I mean, I think populism is just a very amorphous thing that you can bend to various.
No, it's a good point. It's a term that it means different things to different people. Yeah. But I will say, speaking to the union thing, I mean, as recently as 5 years ago, immigration reform was killed by the labor unions and by a poison pill. I mean, we could argue this or not, but a lot of people believe that the sort of coup de grace or whatever was delivered by a poison pill inserted by Byron Dorgan. Almost said Byron York, by North Dakota Senator Byron Dorgan, and supported by President Obama and Jim DeMint, a bipartisan group of Senate leaders.
Now, the other substantive point I want to make here was in the Paul Krugman column. Just not to lose the strand of the critique, a different critique than yours. He was saying this is not. You really can't call the libertarians populist because these are still the same folks that want to cut unemployment insurance and cut food stamps and lower the tax burden of wealthy Americans. So how can you possibly call that inherently populist? I don't know if you think that's an unfair charge from the left.
Well, I thought that Krugman was not well prepared to write that column. And it may be that people will criticize me and say that I'm wrong or that I don't grasp this. But, the conservative movement is something that I focus on pretty closely. And before I wrote this piece, I read, Carney's stuff and Dominich's stuff. And
when you say Carney and Domenech, who are those folks?
I'm sorry. Tim Carney, who is a protege of Bob Novak, who writes for the D.C. Examiner and has been at the forefront for maybe a decade of arguing against that there's a collusion between big business and big government. Sean Trendy at Real Clear Politics, who's written about this. Ben Domenech, co-founder of Red State, who's written about this. He has an e-newsletter called The Transom. He recently did a Blogging Heads episode as a guest. Check that out. And Ross Douthat at the New York Times has written about this. And so I tried to read all that stuff. And so I hope that my critique is greeted as at least more intellectually honest than Krugman's. I feel like he may have made some valid points, but I think it was undermined by the people who are really knowledgeable about this stuff. I think could tell that he didn't exactly know what he was talking about all the time when he wrote it. And so I think that a lot of his critiques will be dismissed by the people the people who kind of really follow this stuff. And hopefully my piece isn't, although in a sense I do hope there's a little controversy about it. You got to want a little disagreement.
But in theory, perhaps some of these libertarian thinkers will read your work more closely than they read Paul Krugman's. You are a member of their tribe, but you feel like, and you make I think a pretty bold argument, counter argument that Bush's framework of compassionate conservatism has more electoral juice than a libertarian populist framework, and this is a phrase that has been. You got the sense that even when it was being used in the Bush era that the Washington conservative community kind of chafed at it What are you saying? We're not compassionate in the first place. You need a special adjective for your special brand of conservatives because we're a bunch of jerks. And then as soon as Bush left the scene, that phrase just dropped off the radar ever since. McCain never used it. Romney never used it. But you want to bring it back and say this is a better way to show conservatism can help society than libertarian populism could.
I actually don't want to bring the phrase back because I think that Bush destroyed the brand because people have come to equate compassionate conservatism with the bad stuff, the excesses of Bush, the military adventurism, the big spending, the not vetoing spending bills, the cronyism. I mean, all, Katrina even. I mean, essentially all the bad stuff from the Bush years has become equated with compassionate conservatism. So I think the brand is tainted. So I would say the name, we need to come up with a better name. I'm not for big spending, policies and all that. What I am for is a positive brand of conservatism that's more in the mold of the optimistic rhetoric employed by Jack Kemp and Ronald Reagan and now Marco Rubio. I think that that sort of... Now, I do realize that Reagan also had a populist side, too. I don't want people to think I don't know that or that I don't think that. But by and large, I like conservatism when it's an optimistic, positive philosophy. And I think that's when it's worked. And I think that George W. Bush, and I know that he lost the popular vote, but he did win 2 presidential national elections. And last time I checked, Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul and Ross Perot didn't.
And even when Bush lost the popular vote, he still did better than McCain and Mitt Romney, popular vote was.
And he won, 40% or something at the Hispanic votes. And so my sense is the problem with libertarian populism. Now, they'll say, well, that's true. Bush did win those 2 things, but the world has changed. People are becoming more individualistic, and we need to adapt. So they're going to say the fact that Bush won is meaningless, that things have changed. But look, I think that, number one, empirically, there's a track record of this working. Number 2, I think if you look ahead mathematically, the libertarian populist message, I think, paints us in a corner where you're probably just fighting over a limited number of dwindling white people. I fear that the rhetoric that would be employed, the sort of, they're taking our jobs rhetoric, would have an effect of turning off, more cosmopolitan folks, urbanites, college graduates, Hispanics, Asians. I would argue that a more optimistic brand of conservatism, call it compassionate, but I don't mean big government. I don't mean big spending. What I'm talking about is just a different philosophy, a different way of looking at the world, a more optimistic conservatism, a Reagan-Kemp mold. Not only is proven to win in the past, but is much more likely to win votes in the future.
I mean, I think that, and correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, this is something I think we talked about at a past show. I feel what the fault line here is you are advocating a problem-solving conservatism as opposed to a, let the chips fall where they may conservatism. You think there should be goals and desired outcomes out of policies, even if they're not big government policies. But there are societal goals that we should have that would make people's lives better, and you think a conservative approach could achieve that. And the libertarian populists, or the libertarians, or whatever you want to call them, they sort of prize the ideology of libertarianism first and foremost, regardless of what the outcome of those policies may end up being.
Well, look, I do think that sometimes the split between me and my adversaries on the right does come down to that. But I don't want to negatively portray proponents of libertarian populism as fitting into that mold, because I think that they sincerely have some very good points, and I think their motives and hearts are in the right place. And I think in some cases that they believe not only what they believe, but in some cases these things really would solve problems. And so, I'm a fan of Tim Carney's work, and I actually agree with him about the free market and about how we should break up the big banks, and about how we should, sort of stop this crony capitalism, whereby you have, big business and big government colluding for more regulations because big business can comply with those regulations and keep the little guy out. I'm populist in that regard. So, but I think that those things are already, in my opinion, part of what I would call free market conservatism. I don't think that they alone necessitate rebranding the movement, and I certainly don't think that they would warrant what I think would be the inevitable outcome, which would be the sort of angry populist rhetoric that we would focus on. So I don't want to diminish the things that they believe in. I think that some of them are very good and should be rolled into the conservative movement as it is. I just think that the way forward is a little bit different.
Well, I know. You're not on a diametrically opposite page policy wise than a lot of these folks. I know there's a lot of overlap in what you would advocate policy wise, but I think just still in the framing of it, and I don't think it's just rhetoric. But to your point. Sure, all these folks would say, if you did things my way, good things will happen. Trust me, the world's not going to fall apart. We're still going to we'll have a thriving middle class. We'll be racially harmonious and all that kind of stuff. But they don't lead with that. Their primary argument is that to have a libertarian government society is good in and of itself. And then its secondary arguments. Well, and by the way, you won't all be poor. You'll be all right. Trust me. And I feel like you come at it differently. You come at it like it would be good for society to have entrepreneurial workers from wherever they may come from. It would be good for society if we had livable cities. It would be good for society if we had effective transportation choices. You have attitudes like that that seem to come first before the process of how they necessarily come about. I think the emphasis on that does end up affecting. If obviously you're not in government, I'm not in government, but if you were in government, what compromises would you accept? If you had an interest in the policy outcome first and foremost, maybe you'd bend a little bit on the ideology, whereas if the ideology was paramount, you wouldn't bend at all.
Right, and I'll give you an example of that. I just, at the Daily Caller blog, I put up 5 creative ideas for fixing the job crisis. And these were taken from a scholar at AEI who wrote this really long, probably unreadable piece for National Review that I don't think anybody read. And I made a listicle out of them and picked his 5 most interesting ideas. And they included things like paying people a stipend to move. Like if you live in Detroit and you're not upside down on a house, but you want to move to North Dakota and get a job, it might be cheaper for us to give you a little money to move than to pay your unemployment. I'm not endorsing that idea, but I'm endorsing we think about that idea.
Right.
Another idea was paying people a bonus to find a job, which you could say that there's some perverse incentives, and maybe there are, but you could also argue it would be cheaper, a one-time bonus for people to get off welfare. I mean, I'm just saying these are interesting ideas we could talk about, and there were 5 of them. Some of them more interesting than that even. So go Google that or something. But
now, while there is this intellectual back and forth going on in the conservative movement, perhaps more a more rich debate and dialogue than perhaps the right gets credit for sometimes. While this is going on, the head of the RNC, Reince Priebus, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, I don't know if anyone in America properly can. He seems to think
you know how you do it. You think of it like it's Ryan Priebus. Right, and if you say it
that
fast,
just rolls off the tongue.
If you say it fast, it's Ryan Priebus.
Gotcha.
Ryan's Business.
He seems to think that what's ailing the Republican Party, what held them back in 2012, is that they had to debate too much. And they had debate in front of moderators that, to essentially quote him, we're interested in promoting the Republican Party. We're interested in promoting the Democratic Party. And therefore, if networks like NBC wants to do a Hillary Clinton miniseries, and if CNN wants to do a Hillary Clinton documentary, then Reince is going to say, well, we're not going to do our debates with you. We're going to choose who our presidential debates are shown, where they're shown, and who moderates them, and we'll have fewer of them. He had some sort of vague threat that if Republican candidates didn't adhere to the RNC debate schedule, they would be penalized in some way. I don't know if he's thought through what that could possibly be. But it seems to suggest to me, maybe even a different take on it, an insular view of politics that is captive to a lot of cranky whining about the media. I mean, everyone wants the media at all sides of the spectrum, but usually the whiners are the ones who are losing, and the ones that know how to deal with it are the ones that win. Instead of trying to deal with the media and do things to help you curry more favorable coverage, I'm sorry that life isn't fair, but life isn't fair. Instead, they're trying to build walls around the media and not subject their candidates to the type of question they will inevitably have to face in a general election contest, in hopes that protects them. It's like a protective tariff. It's a protectionist view of the debating process, and that might save them from being chewed up in the primaries. And the theory is that they won't be nicked to death, and they'll come out stronger and have a better final sprint. But it strikes me as being very myopic and defensive, and may well even lead to more pandering to the farthest fringes of the party in these insular stage debates where they don't have to be subjected, they don't have to face the type of vote or the type of question you would get in a general election, therefore won't be prepared for it. So it strikes me as being very short-sighted. But I don't know, Matt, if you have a different take on it.
Yeah, I do. Actually, I have sort of a nuanced point. Like, number one, I always thought that Republicans should have, irrespective of the Hillary thing, they need to get these debates under control, and I want to talk about that. Number two, I agree with you that using the Hillary films as a catalyst to make this move struck me as gimmicky and victim-y and whiny. So we can talk about that second, but let me just make the sort of substantive point about why I disagree with you in terms of the debates. Because I've been writing this for years. I think I was probably the first person to argue that Republicans shouldn't allow the mainstream media and their moderators to take control of their nominating process. I get what you're saying about having to endure difficult questions, but I think there's a point of diminishing returns. There's a point where taking difficult questions makes you stronger, and then there's a point where it destroys you. And I think there's like 20 debates, primary debates. That's like 15 too many. The RNC should say they're going to be 5 to 7 primary debates. Now, the other problem is, in the old days, you had to, there were like NBC had the TV cameras. They controlled the means of production, so you had to go to the networks probably if you wanted a national debate to be on TV. There's no longer a logistical reason for that to happen. We've seen instances where people like George Stephanopoulos, during a primary debate, brought up, at the time, seeming very random, this question about contraception. Later, it really seemed to play into the whole war on women meme. The notion that George Stephanopoulos, who worked for Bill Clinton, a Democrat operative, would be in charge of moderating a Republican primary debate is absurd on its face. The idea that someone like Chris Matthews might do that is utterly ridiculous. The problem is that in politics, the question is more important than the answer. And so at some point you get these politicians the Republicans on the defensive, talking about things they ought not to be talking about. Doesn't make them stronger necessarily, it makes them weaker. But I'll give you an example. Let's go back to 2008, and let's say that I was moderating a debate between John McCain and Barack Obama. Now, I know that's a general election paradigm, but the point's the same. As a moderator, I could guarantee you that John McCain would win that debate, regardless of what they say. And the way that I would do it is, essentially, the first question would be, service is very important. Senator McCain and Senator Obama, let's talk about what you've done in terms of service. Second question, sacrifice. When is the time that you've really sacrificed for your nation? I mean, if that were the line of questioning, McCain would win. So I do think that moderators matter. I do think that these debates have taken a toll and beaten down Republican candidates. And so I think that Republicans do need to take control of this and quit being pawns for the cable networks. But I just think it was too cute by half the way that Ryan Sprivas sprung this on.
Well, I just want to take up a few of your points there. I mean, number one, I half agree with you on the moderators. I don't think the Republican Party has to accept whatever moderator a network proposes. You can negotiate the moderator. I mean, I think it's not a good idea to negotiate a plant as a moderator. I think that might be just as harmful as having an antagonist as a moderator. But there are people within the NBC stable who are not Chris Matthews. There are people in the ABC stable who are not George Stephanopoulos. You could find somebody who could be an agreed-upon neutral moderator if you were committed to not utterly dictating every aspect of the debate. But even if that's the case, and your bottom line is the question is more important than the answer. And I would argue that you got to have good answers. You have to, at the end of the day, be able to deal with annoying, unfair, loaded, cheap shot questions.
If every question's, why, when did you stop beating your wife? And here's the problem.
Gingrich was the master at turning that stuff around to his advantage and beat the hell out of the moderator for an unfair question. I mean, you have tools at your disposal as the guy behind the podium who gets.
Right, but think, okay, there are certain issues that skew a certain way. I mean, if you ask people questions that are, try to embarrass them, and this might have even been Fox, but the whole raise your hand if you don't believe in evolution. I mean, just those sorts of things are horrible. And we've turned this into like entertainment, and it's a spectacle. It's actually become harmful. I used to believe in this sort of. I used to believe. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I know what you're going to say about Gingrich, and let me say I think that Gingrich, when you're talking about where he went up against John King, and I think that did help Gingrich in the primary. But you look at the overall effect that had on the Republican Party and the overall brand and conservatism. What was good for Newt Gingrich in a particular debate, I don't think necessarily was good for, the Republican Party and the conservative movement.
Well, I mean, I think what was bad for the Republican Party and the conservative movement was that people did not like the answers that they gave on a lot of questions. So I think it's a scapegoating tactic to the moderators for that.
But let's say the number one. I remember there was a question where they had someone from the military via satellite or via video asked a question about, I'm gay, why can't I serve openly, or something like that. And people in the audience booed, and I think they booed the question because they saw it as a sort of gotcha question. They saw it as an example of the mainstream media trying to make conservatives look bad, look like they're not tolerant, and they booed, and then it became conservatives boo a soldier or something like that. I mean, conservatives are being used as pawns. They're being made to look bad by these outlets, and I don't blame them for not being willing to be the butt of the jokes.
But Cena did the same thing to Democrats in 2008. They had the same kind of YouTube questions, the same kind of put you on the spot kind of questions. They had 20+ debates. They were grueling debates. They got really boring after a while. Hillary and Obama tore each other to shreds. Hillary Clinton got completely discombobulated about dealing with illegal immigration questions in those debates. These are questions that a Democratic plant moderator probably would not have asked if they didn't want to trip somebody up. But at the end of the day, Barack Obama at the end of that process, came out stronger for it and was much more duly prepared for the general election because of it. I don't think you can look back at those Democratic debates in 2008 and say they got a whole bunch of softballs by a bunch of networks that wanted to promote Democratic Party candidates and therefore Obama won. I mean, I'm sure there's some on the right who are going to say such things, but you can watch the tapes and decide for yourself. I think you'll find that's not the case at all. There's a lot of hard questioning. There are a lot of uncomfortable questioning, questions that split apart the Democratic coalition, questions that hit the weaker spots of the Democratic Party platform, and they had to deal with it. And I would think that it's sort of in vogue to bemoan the length of the process because it's a lot of talking points, a lot of repetition, and it's a lot of spectacle. It's not substantive. It's not deep thoughts. But I think that at the end there is you do separate some wheat from the chaff with it being a marathon, and some folks who've proven unable to withstand the grueling aspect of it, they end up falling off, and your party might be better off.
I'm not advocating no debates. I think 7 debates is a lot of debates. Maybe make it 10. We don't need 20. And look, do a better job of picking the moderators. And instead of saying we're going to boycott NBC, I think they should say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have Hugh Hewitt be one of the moderators. There's going to be 3 moderators. It ain't going to be Chris Matthews. It's going to be Chuck Todd can be one of them. But Hugh Hewitt or Cal Thomas is going to be one of them. And then ABC's not involved, but you know what? George Will is going to be one of the moderators there too.
So you do neutral and conservative. You wouldn't go maybe left neutral conservative for a panel?
I think panels are fine. And that's something that they would have to consider. But what I think you want to avoid is this situation where you've got these 20 debates being moderated by the mainstream media, who's looking to score points, to get ratings, to create dissension, and who are coming from, frankly, a liberal worldview. And again, this isn't just that I think they're biased toward 2 things. Number one, controversy. They want the clip that makes news that's talked about the next day by everybody. And I think they're coming at this from a liberal worldview. So the issues that they think are the most important aren't necessarily the most important. Certainly not to Republican voters. So I think that it's utterly preposterous that Republicans should entrust the vetting of their nominee to people who have nothing in common with their worldview. I don't blame them on that one bit. Now, look, I think the other extreme would be horrible, right? No debates, or debates, moderated by Steve Forbes only or something. I'm picking a name out of a hat.
Sure.
Pat Robertson, whatever. But I think that things have gone too far. I think it has gotten out of hand, and I think that there was a point of diminishing returns. It's hard to argue, Bill, that these debates didn't harm the Republican Party last time. And Mitt Romney certainly paid a steep price for having to endure those debates.
Now, the other thing went on the Republican side, which I thought was interesting past couple of weeks, and we talked about Rubio before. How well did he handle his immigration moment? And I took a negative tack that he kind of blew it. He ended up not really playing a leadership role by the end of it, even though he was sort of set up that way. But he ended up fading to the background, and McCain and Corker and the Nebraska Senator Hoeven ended up playing a bigger role.
He's North Dakota.
I'm sorry, North Dakota.
North Dakota.
Thank you. But I wrote a piece in the week after that suggesting Rubio could still play that final role if he extended what he did on the floor at the end of that debate and played a leading role debunking a lot of right-wing myths about the Senate bill and saying that these folks are not helping conservatism of Republicans by spreading false information about this compromise. But instead, he seems to have dropped the issue in the summer since the vote is hugging Ted Cruz and is now being a chief proponent of government shutdown unless Obamacare is defunded. And he's also pushing very hard the 20-week abortion ban bill. He's going to be trying to find whatever red meat to the base issue he can find. It feels very defensive and apologetic for his immigration role, instead of following through with the immigration issue, which is going to be a signature issue. And now he doesn't seem to have a signature issue. He's glomming on other people's issues, which are issues that have a kind of paint by numbers conservative base feel to them, and not an approach that suggests I'm a leader for the country. I'm a different kind of Republican kind of approach. So it feels like an example of overcompensation that might hurt him going forward for diminishing his brand. But I don't know if you think that that not being on the Republican side of things, that I'm being too harsh on him.
Well, let me defend Rubio before I attack him. First, it's not like the guy wasn't a hardcore conservative. I mean, don't be so, like, people who weren't following closely may be surprised by this, but he's always been adamantly against Obamacare. He's always been adamantly pro. The best pro-life speech I've ever heard in my life was given by Marco Rubio at the Susan B. Anthony List dinner like 2 years ago. So this, I think people who only know him as the champion of immigration reform maybe have forgotten that the guy's always been a hardcore conservative. Having said that, it does look like it's reasonable. It's reasonable to think he has come to the conclusion that, having stuck his neck out to champion immigration reform, which I think is a profile in courage, that he's decided, I'll never be out conservative again. And so it's predictable that people would see this as pandering. Again, in terms of his positions, this is very consistent. He's consistently been against Obamacare. He's consistently been pro-life. You could question the rhetoric, though, which seems to have been ramped up. You could say that looks different. And, Ramesh, I think it was Ramesh Panubru, somebody made an interesting point that Rubio may be having the worst of both worlds, right? So he offended the right by supporting immigration reform, and now he's offending moderates by being so hardcore on wanting to defund Obamacare, which a lot of, not just moderates, but conservatives like, Governor Scott Walker and Senator Tom Coburn, and even now Mitt Romney, think is insane, quixotic, whatever word works best for you. I will say the other thing too is read. I think it's Pete Weiner. Not sure how to pronounce his name, but he's a hell of a good writer. Over at Commentary, had a piece chastising Rubio for wanting to defund Obamacare, and not just wanting to defund it, but Rubio went on Mark Levin's radio show a couple nights ago and said, if you fund Obamacare, then you are supporting Obamacare. Which is a shot across the bow at conservatives who just think this strategically isn't the right move. And Weiner, he made the point, like, well, let's go through all the budgets and bills that Rubio's voted for in the past. Does he support everything that he's funded in every omnibus bill or whatever? And I suspect the answer to that is, of course, no. So, and this goes back to the Florida State Senate, or State House, where Rubio was the speaker, of course. Did he support everything that he voted for that was tucked in those bills? What if there was a bill that didn't defund Obamacare, meaning that it funded it, but it did a whole bunch of other good stuff, like reform, Social Security? Would he not vote for, So read that column. But your point, Bill, I think is a good point, that Rubio is now in a political pickle where people are questioning his sincerity and his motives.
Yeah, it just feels very it feels knee jerk, and look, maybe he'll be proven right, and they'll say he touched his bases and he gutted it out. I mean, John McCain did turn tail in immigration reform in 2008 for a period of time to try to tamp that back and not that be a flashpoint to gain the nomination. But also, I think every Republican had fought immigration reform and had to pretend they didn't to sustain themselves. I think
I wouldn't. The other thing too is I would say this. I wouldn't. Rubio's been quiet lately about immigration reform. I wouldn't read too much into that. I mean, look, it passed the Senate. He championed it for months and months and months. It passed the Senate. And you could argue that the smart move, if you want it to pass the House, is to shut up about it, especially as they go into August recess. You don't want to fire. This is, by the way, Mickey Kaus would agree with me on this point, that if you want to pass immigration reform, the last thing you want to do is stir up the base as we head into August recess. So just because Rubio has been quiet on that, I wouldn't read anything into that in the sense that he's turned away from it or that he is no longer supporting it. It could be a tactical move to actually get it passed.
I take the point. Before we wrap up, I do want to. Do you have any quick thoughts about Jeff Bezos taking over the Washington Post?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the Washington Post sold for $60 million less than the Huffington Post. Tell me that. I mean, this is the news, and I know that they've got overhead and pensions and a building and all that stuff. But look, this is the Washington Post. They took down a president, and they got $60 million less than the Huffington Post.
And $25 million less than Alex Rodriguez, correct?
That too. And this tells you everything you need to know about the changing media environment in which we live.
But it's not a significant thing. The Washington Post, to do investigative journalism, to do actual journalism, is a labor-intensive, costly process. And new media like Huffington Post can do a lot of things on the cheap. You don't need nearly as much staff to have side boob slideshows. So it's going to be.
Thank God for him too, Bill, because they're paying my salary as well. God love them. They're funding my writing about libertarian populism and stuff.
I thought Daily Caller was more like a who's hot slideshow as opposed to a side boob thing. That's not so conservative, I thought.
Well, I'm supporting more side boob. I think we need to ramp up the side boob, and I like the under boob too. We need to. We cannot be out Huffington posted on that. And by the way, let me say this: that the Huffington Post won a Pulitzer Prize, and the Daily Caller won an Edward R. Murrow Award, and I think this would not have been possible had it not been for side boob.
But obviously the question on everyone's mind is, what's Bezos' agenda? How is he gonna overhaul the place? Does he have some sort of bright idea that would make newspapers viable in the digital age? Does he have a political agenda here? Is he going to be pushing libertarian candidates? Is he going to be pushing liberal candidates? I think everyone's got a different conspiracy on the subject, but of course no one really knows, and. The hopeful take on it is at least somebody out there wants to invest in journalism.
Right. Well, and that's the real interesting. And by the way, read Lou Cannon. Lou Cannon had a great piece up at Real Clear Politics. The great Reagan biographer, Bill. You know him. Mm-hmm. You know his work. Great piece up about the Washington Post and how this is an end of an era. But look, some people are suggesting that the model is that these newspapers cannot compete in a free market, and that the model is to essentially subsidize them, have rich people come in the way that rich people, like Carnegie and others in the Gilded Age, the robber barons so-called robber barons would support universities and libraries and philanthropy. That this is a philanthropic thing, supporting journalism. And newspapers, it should be something that is, done by, sort of rich people, not as a capitalist endeavor per se.
I mean, I don't feel like that's all that different than the way journalism has been practiced throughout American history. I mean, it's obviously been more profit-making than it is today, but newspapers have often been held by wealthy families as pet projects, and with a certain degree of uneasy melding of public service and pushing personal rich people's agendas. That's, we don't have a society based on a collectivist-owned media operation. I mean, this is not the way America has been. So I don't feel that
conservatives have they're going to have a hard time complaining about that, because most of the conservative magazines don't make money. They're funded by people, and a lot of the most of the 501c3s who enjoy tax, they're not really competing in a free market. And our pastors who are so worried about preserving their, tax status. So, we can talk about, the Daily Caller, we have investors, but we're out there, actually making money. But, by and large, the sort of august conservative outlets and magazines don't really make money.
Right. And I don't think that's necessarily a knock. I mean, I'm not against subsidies for a lot of things. But obviously, I'm for more subsidies than you are, probably. But it's not a bad thing that some people out there want to invest and spend their money to have
free speech.
That's
free
right.
Speech.
So you want to be. It's good to explore what their agendas might be and be aware of what their agendas might be. I don't think they should. Free speech, cuts both ways. But I don't feel this is a disturbing descent into our media being owned by the hands of a few robber barons.
Right. But
because it's always been that way.
Yeah, but I will say this, that I agree with you, Bill, but you need to tell your friends on the left that, because when Murdoch buys the Wall Street Journal or the Kochs try to buy the LA Times, people lose it, and they immediately assume the worst.
Well, I mean, I think in the case of Murdoch, I think the Wall Street Journal now is not as good a paper as it was. I mean, and that's it's that. Murdoch has an agenda. I think the Wall Street Journal used to have a better job of having a firewall between the reporting and the editorializing. I think Murdoch has hampered that. But I judge it on the product. I looked at what he did with the paper, and I didn't just make a knee-jerk assumption it was going to be the way. I felt like the actual product that came out of it had more of a slant to it. And I have free speech, and I get to talk about that and see if I can get people to look at their coverage in a different way. I
think they do good work, but you can buy the New York Times.
That's right. And that's run by a wealthy family too.
Yeah.
I think they have shareholders, but let's not kid ourselves here. There's a wealthy family behind it.
I would rather work at an outlet like the Slug Line, where I work, that has a bar and a ping pong table. But that's just me. You can work at one of these big old, actually, there is prestige. I don't know that I would, as much as I talk about the gutsy fun that comes with working at a sort of cool young new media outlet, there's prestige that comes with working at the Post or the Times too. So I think we can hope that they find a way to make it. Those kids, if they can't make it, then if those kids can't make it,
we'll always have side boob.
We will always have side boob.
Always good to talk to you, Matt.
Likewise. Now, as you know, Bill, I will be out next week. You will be out the week after, so it'll be 2 weeks before we are together again, I think.
We'll get a healthy dose of Justin Green.
That is right. Tell him to speak up when I'm not here. Speak loudly and or forever hold his peace.
Have a good vacation.
All right, man. And you too in a couple weeks. But everyone else, be back here next week, because I won't be here, but Bill will, and we'll take you on another deep dive into the DMZ.
Take care.